How about now?
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So nice to be back in Perugia. Thank you all for coming. We are going to talk about journalists who've left the world of journalism for the world of corporate media. And this panel came about because in my job, I kept encountering these individuals who had made this leap, and I was really curious. You know, what was it like for them as individuals? What skill sets could they bring to the corporate world? What was that decision-making process like? And what are the wider implications for society as well? So I'm Garrett Goodman. I work at an AI startup called Papercup. We dub videos into foreign languages to help organizations speak to their audiences in their own language. But I met this illustrious panel at my last job, where they were all at one point or another actually clients. So starting over here, we have Lauren Moraski, who was formerly at the Huffington Post and is now the editor-in-chief at Merck, the pharmaceutical company. Here we have Isabelle Roughol, who was formerly at Le Figaro and then LinkedIn and now is independent, running her own media company, which she will talk about. And we have Mark Frankel at the end, formerly of the BBC and head of social media at Philip Morris, the tobacco company. So, having just recently changed jobs myself, I thought we could actually start there and talk about what that decision was like for you guys to leave the world of journalism and go into the corporate world. And so maybe if you could just talk a bit about your kind of career path, where you were at that moment when you decided what that decision-making process was like. Why don't we start at this end with you, Lauren?
All right, thanks, Garrett, and hi, everyone. I spent my career in various different forms of journalism, ranging from radio to digital to broadcast TV. I worked at a number of different organizations, from ABC News to HuffPost, CBS News, Reuters, and I mostly covered entertainment news. But I did everything from writing about financial news to info security. I became a manager, and I really loved becoming a leader and leading teams and editing. And my last post at HuffPost was a special projects editor. And essentially I was overseeing different content across the entire news organization, trying to find different partnerships and strategic initiatives to help raise revenue, grow the brand, and also increase membership. And so that really gave me an idea of like, hey, maybe I could do something else besides just like editing stories, et cetera. I really feel like I want to, put all the skills that I've gained throughout my entire career into like a really good place. As things go, and my former network of reporters and journalists, someone reached out to me who was working at Merck. She said, look, Lauren, there's this amazing opportunity. They're looking for an editor-in-chief at Merck. And I'm like, that sounds really interesting. What does it entail? And essentially it was to grow sort of like an internal newsroom of sorts. They were really looking for someone with a journalism background to bring that sensibility to Merck. Merck is a pharmaceutical company, very well respected in the industry. And they wanted to basically have someone tell the corporate story. And so when I interviewed, I was really leaning on all the things that I collected throughout my journalism career: storytelling, story angles, video, podcasting. How can I infuse that into a space like Merck? I won them over, and I was hired. And in the last year and a half, I've been able to build a team of reporters, or content producers, as I call them. A lot of them do come from the journalism world. I have a graphic design team and some folks who work on video, and it's been a wild ride. I'm happy to dive in a little bit more, but that's just kind of a high-level overview of how I came to Merck.
Switch this one on. Hello, everybody. I had a slightly different path. I was at the BBC for nearly 20 years. It feels like a lifetime. It was a lifetime, actually. In television, in radio, and in the final few years on the digital side, website and social media. My last job was the editor of social media for BBC News. And I was sitting in the newsroom at the BBC back in 2018, having just returned from a short fellowship, and I'm thinking to myself, what do I do next? What do I want to do next? Where do I want to go? Not particularly I didn't have any sort of well-formed ideas in my head, but I knew I wanted to do something with a sort of public purpose. And it's quite fortuitous us all sitting here in Perugia, but it's my mother died exactly 10 years ago from breast cancer, and she was a very heavy smoker. And she lived in Perugia. So I've been spending the last 2 days walking around Perugia. It's quite poignant, actually, being back here again. But when the phone rang, my mobile phone rang back in 2018, and the chief content officer from Philip Morris was on the end of the line, you can imagine my reaction. I put the phone down. I said, on no accounts would I ever want to work for one of the world's most vilified companies. Why would I ever imagine doing something like that with the experience that I'd had sort of nursing my mother through to the end? But they were very persistent, and they kept coming back, and they said, don't you understand what we're trying to do? We're trying to move this company away from our core product and completely turn the company inside out. And what we need are journalists. We need people who understand storytelling, they understand the narrative, they understand how they can help us to position this company as being passionate about change, passionate about something completely and utterly different. So I started to think about it. I thought, actually, you know, I've run for cancer research. I've thrown brickbats at people who smoke. I've been a sort of activist on the outside. I wonder what it would be like working from the inside and being part of a content operation. So I decided to take the plunge. I joined them, and I was global social media, sort of head of global social media for Philip Morris for about 3 years until just recently, and I'm just about to leave onto a new challenge. But it's been absolutely fascinating working from the inside. I think we'll get onto that shortly. But that's been my journey, and working now in a content team inside a corporate using those journalistic skills.
My turn. Hi, and thanks for having me, Garrett. So I'm Isabelle Roughol. I think Garrett worded the question this way just on purpose to get a rise out of me, because I detest the expression leave journalism, because I did not leave journalism. I'm extremely militant about this. I am a journalist. I don't work in communications. No objection to it. It's just not what I'm interested in. And so I'm very much a journalist. So I started out as a kind of in foreign news. I was a foreign correspondent in Cambodia. I was working on the foreign desk at Le Figaro. I joined LinkedIn in 2012. It wasn't exactly like a decision to, I'm going to take my career in a different position. I was a young journalist who graduated in a financial crisis. I was on a succession of temp contracts, which ended in newspapers that were shrinking, and I was unemployed for a few months, freelancing, doing a few things, and then I got on LinkedIn one morning to update my profile and look for jobs, and there was an ad. LinkedIn is looking for editors for itself. And I was like, what? And I was actually extremely hesitant in the beginning, precisely for that reason. I was like, I do not want to leave journalism. I just got started here. You're not going to push me out. And so I was debating, but I needed a job. And so I was like, I'll have a conversation. And from the first conversation, I was completely sold. Because essentially what the editorial team did at LinkedIn is, it still does, and by the way, is hiring like crazy right now. So if you're interested, talk to me at the end. I'm not there anymore, but I can talk to you about it. Is essentially very much news work, but instead of doing it for a newspaper or a news website, you're doing it for a platform. And the goal of news content, just like for any media organization, is to engage the users of the platform and to get them coming back to LinkedIn, which, it's not how LinkedIn makes its money, but it's part of getting people active on the platform. And so journalists there will do, I built a daily business newsletter there. They do podcasts. They do some original reporting, though it's mostly curation. So if you're a Twitter user and you think about Twitter Moments and the team that's curating that, is a similar team doing similar work at LinkedIn, and also a lot of work with non-professional writers, influencers and creators who create on the platform, and kind of helping them, guide them as editors. So there's just a lot of different angles to that. And I was very lucky to join when there was 4 of us on the team, and got to build the operations outside the US and outside the English language. And so now they're hiring like crazy right now, so it's going to be pretty sure 150 people pretty soon, even 200. And I left 2020, January 2020, because I was quite burnt out and I just needed a break, and I was going to go on a great sabbatical year and travel, and that was terrible timing. And ended up launching my own podcast and newsletter and niche media company called Borderline, which is about living across borders, being multicultural, being a serial immigrant, which is what I am. And so that's another option that's open as well, and that's really growing. And that we can talk about later. It's being a creator and building your own platform, rather than being freelance. Given what freelance pays these days, I think you're better off just building your own platform, building your own business.
So I think we're going to get into the. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
No, you're still muted.
Thank you. Tech support. I think we're going to get into a lot of the points of contrast between the traditional media world, the traditional world of journalism, and corporate media. But I thought maybe we just start with something very day-to-day. When each of you joined these bigger companies, what was that first moment when you said, whoa, this is totally different than a newsroom? Or maybe, let's start with you.
I was like, what did I just do? And I miss news, and I wanted to run back to the newsroom the first day I started. But I realized this is an amazing opportunity. I have to give it a chance. It was very different because in news, you're working collaboratively, or you're working on a story or editing a story in a team, and you write the story, you put it out there in the world. You might have an editor. Sometimes your story goes through legal if it's an investigative piece, but other than that, it just goes out there in the world. What I didn't realize at a place like Merck and a lot of big corporations, Merck in particular is a very highly regulated industry. There's lots of layers of approvals. There's lots of layers of legal. And to get one feature story out on the website, and I oversee content that goes on the website internally, externally, and then the social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, et cetera. It could take 2 months for a story to actually go live on the site because of all the rounds of editing, et cetera. And then, I'm used to being creative. Well, I want to use this word. Well, this is not a word that Merck uses. So I felt like it took a little bit of getting used to, but now a year and a half in, I've had so much exciting freedom in some ways, and I've charted my own path. One of the things I'm most proud of doing was when I got there, I was like, there's no newsletter that goes out to the entire global company. There's just a lot of these piecemeal newsletters and no one place to get all the news you need to know as an employee about what the company is working on. So I pitched it. Some people were really hesitant, some leaders were like, I don't know, we had something years ago, 15 years ago, it didn't work. I said, give me a shot. Let me know how it's gonna, I'm just gonna do it. So I said, in a month, if no one's reading it, the open rate is low and the click-through rate is low, we'll just do away with it. Let's test and learn, let's experiment. And I'm proud to say that a year later, it's called InScope. InScope has become a thing. It's a product. People want to be featured in InScope. They want their stories in InScope. So that is one of those things where you come to a corporation, that's why they brought me on board, I was like, why can't we do this? So that's sort of.
So, you want to jump in?
Yeah. No, it's just because your question, I could see the moment when you're like, okay, what was it? And for me, it was a few weeks in, they sent me to Silicon Valley so I was based in Paris when I started, and they sent me to headquarters, Mountain View, California, to kind of meet a lot of the people that I was going to work with. And so this was 2012. And so first, the editorial team was under product, which it was the first time that I heard the word product, because I don't think in 2012 we were talking about product much especially in a 150-year-old newspaper that I was at before. And I get to Silicon Valley, and there's just this incredible office, and there's the frozen yogurt machine and the free lunch and the ping pong tables. And this was 2012, and it was really exciting to join tech. And, I've experienced enough of Silicon Valley that I'm just a little bit more critical now, but at the time it was just really and complete sheer enthusiasm. And I remember sitting down with a software engineer who, grabbed a pen and a piece of paper and was like, here's how an algorithm works. And it was just like, whoa, like just mind blown. It's just like meeting a whole array of people that I had just no idea even existed or what they could work on. And that energy, that fire of joining Silicon Valley in 2012, at a time when it was just pure, like, the future is beautiful and we're going to change the world. Yeah. As misguided and partial as that was just a really, really special energy. And coming from newspapers, where literally every place that I had worked at since then, from my very first internship, like first week of my internship, I got to sit in a newsroom and see a bunch of people get laid off. And that was the tone of my career as a young journalist until then. And so to be in a place that was so optimistic about the future was just completely mind-blowing and very powerful.
And that's why you want to stay at big tech now, right?
I bring the best of both worlds together, hopefully, now.
Mark, what was your first whoa moment?
So, I'm going to pick up on that optimism, because I think that's something that really kind of binds a lot of these kind of roles together, because as a journalist, you're often weighed down by things that can't happen. Oh, the technology can't be improved. There's a limited budget. You need to do things on a shoestring. Time is limited. I mean, one of the things that struck me first was, on my first day, my boss said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, what tools do you need? What services do you need? How much money do you need?" And I said, "Well, do we not have a budget?" And he said, "Well, that's for you to define." And I said, "Well, what about the strategy?" And he said, "Well, that's for you to define." I mean, it was quite daunting, to be quite honest. I mean, I had to sort of take a deep breath, stand back and go, okay, what am I going to build? How many people do I need? How will I organize them? How will we arrange our resources? What platforms do we need to prioritize? But the benefit is, if you go to the right place and there is a vision and there's a can-do attitude, they put stuff behind you very quickly. And that was my impression. On the flip side, there's a lot of oversight. It's a different kind of oversight to being a journalist. As a journalist, you get that editorial oversight of people needing to read what you're writing, or to understand that what you're producing is in the interest of everybody, the audiences that you're trying to serve. My experience of working in the corporate world is suddenly you're faced with an army of lawyers. Not just one lawyer. There was the media lawyer in the BBC newsroom that I used to love, because I used to wander up to him or her, depending on what day it was, and I'd say, "This is the piece that we're writing," or "This is the piece that we're planning on broadcasting." And they'd look at it and they'd go, we'd have a quick chat about risk, and they'd go, "Well, it doesn't seem to be too risky to me. Let's go for it." It was that kind of conversation. Whereas at PMI, where I've just been about to leave, I would come up with something and I'd phone a lawyer, and they'd phone a lawyer, and then that person would phone a lawyer, and suddenly I'd have 4 lawyers on the call, and a tweet that we might need to put out would have to go through 3 separate lawyers before it could even see the light of day, by which stage 140 or 280 characters had become sort of 690 characters, and I was trying to explain to them that, there is a limit to what you could put out on Twitter. So there are restrictions to how you can say what you can say, but from a resources point of view, it was extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary.
So speaking of resources, and you mentioned this, Isabelle, in your intro, I wanted to touch on the point of the pandemic and what that was like in terms of work-life balance and the kind of support that you felt from your employer. And I know that you guys keep in touch with your friends who are still in the media, and we know that it's been very difficult working in newsrooms during the pandemic. What was it like working for, Fortune 500?
I mean, it's interesting because I started Merck in the midst of the pandemic. I was working at HuffPost, so I have the comparison of working in a newsroom and then going to Merck. Working at HuffPost, I mean, it was just one day we were in the newsroom, I was hosting something, and the next thing we're all at home. And, there was a lot of nervousness throughout the newsroom about whether or not we could survive. You know, advertising was low, our membership model was changing. But when I got to Merck, you know, it was one of those things where I onboarded remotely, and I felt like I felt like a member of the team. I felt like it was, you know, definitely, I mean, the resources obviously at a corporate company are very high, and so they kind of roll out the red carpet for you without, you know. But I still did, I mean, quite honestly, I did, you know, miss my my newsroom world so those first few months.
What does that mean, roll out the red carpet for you? Like, what's something that you experienced there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, you need this, no problem, right? You need a phone, you need this, you know, all those kinds of things, it's not a problem. You know, very different than working in a newsroom where it's scrappy, resources are thin. It's, you know, well, maybe next year we'll get you a promotion. Maybe next year we'll give you another team member. It's very much like, oh, you know, annual salary raises are kind of a thing. You know, I've spent many years in news, and yeah, you know, we're not doing any raises this year. So those types of things make a big difference when you're working at a big company. And so the perks there are really great. What I will say though too is that everyone loved the fact that I came from news, and that they really appreciated and respected my experience, and that was really nice. So it was very welcoming experience coming in there for the first time.
Garrett, I can say that just from my point of view, from a mental health point of view with the pandemic, I was absolutely blown away with the support that I got and the whole team got. I mean, in the first few weeks of the pandemic, when we were all a little bit sort of dazed and confused about what we should do and how we should operate and so forth from home, we got an email came through to say, what do you need? Do you need a new desk at home? Do you need a new chair? Do you need sort of back support? Do you need a week's worth of massages? Do you need, I mean, it was absolutely extraordinary. I've never seen such support, actually. And more than that, they went out of their way to make people available to talk to. They recognized that there was a difference between those that were more experienced and were living with families, and those that were on their own and working on their own in a fairly isolated way. So some people had support, people at home they could talk to, others didn't, and they were very, very recognizing of that. And they put on lots of activities that people could do, quizzes and so forth down the line and so forth, to try and, as much as they could, build a sense of community whilst people were stuck really in their home settings. So I think, yeah, we felt pretty supported through that whole period.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't work during the I mean, I worked independently during the pandemic. I was on sabbatical first, and so it was actually a really weird thing to see everyone else, you know, having to deal with it from the outside, and I'm very grateful that I didn't. But being in touch with, you know, with my former team, which I still am, I think the big difference, at least in our case, is that everything was already in place to be working remotely. So I spent years managing, my team was spread out, you know, all over the world, from Brazil to China to Japan to Australia. I managed people that I never met in person. I think I might have met them once at an offsite, but you know, I never actually set foot in Brazil, and I was managing Brazil or Japan. So Zoom was a tool that we were well familiar with for a long time. And things like Zoom fatigue is something that was extremely familiar with before the word existed. I think the major difference, the thing that I had really insisted on my team, and that the whole company insisted on, is solid travel budgets, so that you're still able to meet in person and connect in a way that you can't over a laptop. And so I'm sure the pandemic was super hard on everyone. I think it's just these companies were probably better prepared than most.
I think you've lived an interesting experience too, in that, you know, we're talking about how supportive these companies can be, and I think we've all generally come to become more mindful of burnout and how real that is. But you left this company, as you mentioned, because of burnout. Do you think that their approach changed after the pandemic? Do you think that this is something that, had you weathered the pandemic, you would have stayed with the company?
Gotta be diplomatic here. I think Honestly, no. I think, and I don't think this is an issue with the company. I've become increasingly, I think, disillusioned with just corporate capitalism. And, you know, I'm not a radical anti-capitalist, but actually it's just the way that the world of work is organized nowadays, with technology and constantly being connected, means that literally everyone around me has burnt out or is about to or will. And I'm just increasingly a believer in careers that require moments of pause. Because I was seriously full on like a sprinter for 8 years. And I remember that one of the first things that someone told me when I joined LinkedIn was, you'll see, this is a marathon, but you're gonna have to run it like a sprint. And I did for 8 years, and I was really tired, and I needed this break. And it's been a couple years. I feel 100 times better than I did 2 years ago, and I'm actually currently, again, on a full-time job hunt and feeling really excited about it and about the possibilities in a way that I wasn't excited about anything 2 years ago. And I think that's just the way that modern careers are, and they're gonna have to last. And, I think for our generations, they're gonna have to last well into our 60s and into our 70s, and it's just going to look very different from what our parents' careers looked like, and that's fine. And I hold nothing against the company, because honestly, it was the best experience of corporate work that I could have had, but it's still corporate work in the 21st century. And I want to say something to what you were saying about rewards and resources. I was talking just last night at dinner about salary. And now that I'm on job search, I'm realizing just how terribly paid journalists are, especially in the UK. I don't know, the job market in the UK is super weird. The salaries are ridiculously low when you look at cost of living. And it's especially true in media. And, just to talk numbers, because I think we should talk numbers. 5 years ago, I was starting my junior team members on 60K pounds. And this was 5 years ago. I'm sure it's higher now. Annual raises are a given. It's around 3 to 4% where you're doing your job adequately. It's much more. If it's a promotion, it's around 20%. I just want to be realistic about what numbers are when you're not in a traditional newsroom and in an industry that's shrinking. These are the numbers in the corporate world, and these are just not the numbers that we're seeing in media. And I know it's a struggling industry, but if you don't give people money, we're talking about diversity. If you don't pay people, if you need to be rich already to start a career in media, if you're not able to build generational wealth in the career that you choose, you're not going to have diversity in our industry. And so I think these opportunities, like Martin and Lauren are doing and what I did, this is also a chance for people with journalism skills to build something, and doing great work for the benefit of the public is wonderful, but we have to be realistic as well about what people look for in a career, and it's also rewards for themselves and for their families.
So maybe on that note, we can zoom out a bit. What do you guys think are the implications for society when you have the corporate sector that's offering interesting compensation, opportunities to grow, viable career path, and you face oftentimes doom and gloom, repeated cycles of layoffs within the traditional media? What does it mean when you could call it a brain drain of highly skilled journalists who are leaving and going into the corporate side? You look like you're ready to jump in, Mark.
Well, rather like Isabelle, I've never stopped being a journalist. I left the BBC 3.5 years ago, and I still feel as much a journalist today as I did 3.5 years ago. The difference is I work in a corporate world. I work in a corporate setting. I don't work for a news organisation. And so to answer your question, one part of your question, I don't think journalism is any poorer for jobbing journalists working in a corporate world. I think that, to Isabelle's point about pay, there is a real problem with fair pay for fair work within the media industry, and that is but I think that's a very separate question to the decision that some journalists take to move from working for a media organisation to working for a business. or because a lot of media organizations are businesses, but for working for a corporate organization, so private organization. And I think it's kind of what I said at the beginning, that I would never have made that switch if I didn't feel there wasn't a public purpose behind it. For me, what motivated me to go into journalism is the same motivation that has remained with me in the corporate world, which is a desire to try and do something or be working in a field that is making a difference to public life in some way. At Philip Morris, it was all about public health. I'm about to go to International SOS. That's also going to be about public health in a different way. And for me, that's always been the motivation. What difference can I make? That's what gets me up in the morning. And okay, I'm not writing investigative articles or putting broadcasts together that will be consumed on a media outlet, but I'm still working in a communication setting and trying to make the world understand what a difference a company can make if it was positioned in the right way or it was orientated in the right way. And I think that's very valuable. I think there's a lot of value in that. And I think a lot of journalists underestimate. You guys, I think, if you're interested in this world, it's really easy to underestimate what value you bring to it. There's a lot of people in the corporate sector that simply don't know how to tell a story. They don't know the value of what they're doing is extraordinary, but they can't communicate it. They can only communicate it through really banal press releases and through systems that nobody really wants to hear and understand. And if the company that you're working for is trying to do something quite radical and you're a journalist with an instinct for storytelling and communication, you can make a world of difference and it can be hugely valuable.
What do you think, Lauren? I'm going to ask you a classic Perugia question. What does this mean for the future of journalism?
Well, I would say that it's interesting because, like I said earlier, I was able to infuse all my journalism experience into this role, and I'm so proud to have do so. But I think the future of journalism, I think, is still bright. I mean, I teach at a journalism class. I went to Columbia Journalism School. I'm very much like you, consider myself a journalist. So I think it's ever evolving, and I think that losing me from I was in the news world. Now I'm using these skills in the corporate world. I do feel similarly to Mark, where working for a healthcare company, pharmaceutical company, where its mission is to use like the power of leading edge science to save and improve lives. It drives the people who work there, including myself when I work there too. So I'm still hopeful about journalism. I do think that it's interesting to pursue these other potential opportunities. When I left HuffPost, I wasn't leading a team, and it was something I really missed. And I wasn't going to have the opportunity to do that again at HuffPost. And so I wanted to move up in my career. I wanted to lead a team again. That was very important to me. And so I needed to make this step to be a manager, be a team lead again. And this opportunity allowed me to do that. And I'm very happy I did it.
Yeah, and adding to that, I think if journalism gets poorer in this context, it's only when it refuses to keep within its circles and bring back to the news world the people who have done these things in their career, because I know for myself, I learned an amount of things working in tech that I never would have learned in newsrooms. And I know for a fact because every career conversations I've had when I was working in traditional newspapers was like, oh, you're ambitious. You're gonna have to learn to wait your turn. Oh, we don't have funding for training. Or every manager I've ever had, before, some were well-intentioned, but not great. Some were bullies. None of them ever had management training. And I was deeply trained as a manager, and every manager that was under me was deeply trained as a manager and intentional and thoughtful in their leadership practice. And that's something that we don't have in the media industry. I learned about product thinking, I learned about strategy, I learned about business, about monetization, all these skills that we need in traditional media. And I get a little angry that, 10 years ago when I joined LinkedIn, people kind of in the industry kind of raised an eyebrow. Oh, you're leaving journalism. And the fact that 10 years later, I'm still having these conversations with people like, oh, that's not really, like, sure, but is it really though? And it's just like, I think like we really need to move on from that and welcome these skills. And the thing I will say is if you do make this move into your career, you're going to learn a lot, you're going to benefit a lot. You are likely to still have a fight on your hands if you want to bring all of that back into a news role. It's something I'm trying to do right now, and I'm having these conversations. And I think it's something that we need to do. I'm hoping that, give it another decade and it's going to become more common. But I think it's something that we really need to do and just broaden the skills that go into this industry. Obviously, when it's a shrinking industry, it's hard because there's only so many roles. But I think we will learn from it. And I'm really heartened by this entrepreneurial movement that's happening in the industry because you do see a lot of people, creating their own platforms. And, if you won't open the door for us, we'll break through the wall. It's fine.
Mark, what do you think? What are one or two things that you picked up after leaving the media that you wish they were actually teaching or you were learning on the job from within?
From where I am now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, picking up on what Isabelle's just said, I think that the thing that shocks me, daily almost, is how I could have got through 20 years at the BBC with so much of our work being not particularly measurable. And, I have regular conversations with my team, and there are objectives that are really clear. Everybody knows what the KPIs are for performance. There is a really clear sense of progress and where everybody needs to get to and what needs to be done. And I look back with great fondness in many ways to the time that I was at the BBC, but with also a sense of shock that I got through so many years without actually ever knowing what I was going to be measured by in terms of success from one year to the next. And I would be willing to take a straw poll of you all in the room here today and say, it's journalists, when you have your annual appraisal with your manager, is there ever a conversation where you are looking back at specific achievements that are measurable in particular ways that you can say, okay, well, I've achieved X and I've achieved Y, and therefore I'm owed something in return? I don't think it works like that in journalism to a large extent. I'm generalizing. I think it possibly does in some places. And I think that's the thing, that there are lots of things that the world of media can learn from the corporate sector. And I think one of the big lessons is that being measurable is not a dirty word. It actually helps people to understand where their careers are heading and what they need, what skills they have and what experience they have and what they don't have and what they need to still accumulate, and also what training they need and where the gaps are and what mentorship they may require and so forth. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. Your career shouldn't be something that you wake up one morning and you think, actually, I'd quite like to go that way, or I'd quite like to go this way. Or yes, we all have epiphany, and we all have these moments of, inspiration and so forth, but for everything to be governed by the sort of whim of the moment and to be so unmeasurable, I think is extraordinarily challenging, particularly for younger journalists and those that are coming into the industry in the first place and need a sense of direction.
And it doesn't have to be measurable by, like KPIs, like, numbers of stories published per day or clicks on stories. Because the second you say measurable, a lot of people are like, ooh, you're gonna, give me these targets. And it's really about, like, what's your impact? What are you doing for the public? What are you doing for the community? What is the ultimate goal besides having your story in by deadline? It's just having a little bit of more of a vision. And yes, that's definitely something that your eyes are open to especially when you get out of that daily news cycle and that rush to deadline every single day.
And was that similar or different for you coming from the Huffington Post, something that was a little, digitally native organization? When it comes to measurement, did you find that to be a very smooth transition into the corporate world?
Well, that's an interesting question. HuffPost was very rooted in data and analytics, right? Because we had trending stories, we had feature stories, and it was always a topic of conversation in the newsroom. And so when I went to Merck, they were just starting to use metrics and analytics to inform the content. They were sort of starting that route, and they liked the fact that I had at least an eye for it, and that I used it to inform my future decision makings when it came to content coverage. And so I think that we're only growing in that space. And similar to what you said about the impact, yeah, sure, we're looking at how many page views, how many click-through rates, how many video views, but we're also looking about how does it raise the reputation? What are people saying about the company? How do people feel? What I came from, a lot of what HuffPost was about was people-first storytelling, and I found that this people-first storytelling, when we're focusing on a person, a profile, at Merck, really resonates with the audiences. We use paid media to sort of get that in front of people. We have original native or content as well, but the metrics and the analytics is never going away, and no matter what job I go to next, it's going to be a part of that position, whether it's a news or media or a tech company.
For the two of you who are still at these big companies, Mark and Lauren, what's it like being on the other side of the reporting? What's it like representing a company who's the subject of the reporting as opposed to doing the reporting yourselves?
Well, I mean, I think that one of the things I've learned in the last few years at PMI was that before I joined, if you said to me your reputation as a tobacco company, I would shake my head and say they are inherently evil. Everyone working there is clearly intent on destruction, killing. They're a rapacious group. How could anybody work there who has a conscience, any ethics, any morality? And yet in 3 years, the thing that I found really fascinating is that, well, the 2 or 3 things I'd say. Firstly, I have never met a greater bunch of charitable-minded people in my entire career. And just to, a few examples during the pandemic, the number of initiatives going on in the company to raise money through food banks and local community initiatives and so on that was happening throughout the company in different countries was just extraordinary. And the amount of money that they raised for those different initiatives was mind-blowing. And equally with the situation in Ukraine at the moment, the amount of aid that's being raised by the company in different ways and so forth. So I think it certainly burst my rather kind of over-liberal perception of the corporate world before I joined, that that nobody working there could possibly have a moral conscience. The other thing I'd say, though, is that there is I think a tendency that journalists have, and I'm going to generalize here, but I certainly had this, so I'm sort of culpable to some extent, of writing your conclusion before you've done your research. And I think companies like PMI and pharmaceutical companies to some extent as well, there is a tendency that journalists will have to think the worst before they've actually genuinely understood the business. And if a business is going through a major change, there will be a lot of complexity to that change. And you need to understand, well, what's motivating a company to change its core business? Why would a company like Philip Morris, that's made an enormous amount of money out of the sale of cigarettes, want to stop selling cigarettes? It just doesn't make any sense in many ways. So you've got to ask yourself those tough questions. You've got to see the complexity of what they're trying to do for what it's worth and understand the market, the business, the different regulatory regimes in different countries and so forth. And as I became more and more accustomed to what they were trying to do, I started to see these things in all the different levels that they were being communicated. And what that meant is that I was able to look at the press in a different way. And I went back to some of the commentary that I was reading in the Financial Times, in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, and you have a totally different perspective because you read these pieces and you say, well, how can they write this stuff? They don't actually understand the fact that, in Thailand, for example, you can go to prison for buying a vaping device. Whereas in the UK, you can buy one online and use it freely. It's not a single playing field. And yet, when you read a newspaper or you go online and you read the press about some of these things, you would think that the entire country, the entire world is one country and one regulatory authority. And so there's a real lack of understanding of the complexity, I think, in amongst many, many journalists about the corporate world. And I think that's one of the things that I became most accustomed to when I joined.
Yeah, it's actually a really good question. I find myself like a cheerleader almost for the company because I wanted to do well, right? I want there to be, even though I don't work on the press side, I'm very close to it, right? I'm not putting the media releases out, but I want it to be reflected in a good light, which is interesting from journalism, because in journalism you're writing the story, you're getting the story out, whether it's good, bad, whatever. Here you become like a fan, right, of the company, and you're like in it to win it, right? Like, for example, with Merck, we were in the running for a COVID-19 antiviral. This could have been, have major impact on people who are immunocompromised, for example. So I was like on the edge of my seat waiting for the FDA to approve it, for example, and everything. So I'm watching very closely about how it's covered in the Times and the Wall Street Journal. So it's a very different lens by which you're looking at it. One other thing I'll say is working in a newsroom, I feel like I was so on top of everything that was going on. Even if my beat was entertainment, I knew it was going on in politics, sports, culture, everything. But working at a company, a corporation, you're really living in that space. Everything I do most of the day is Merck. So that was a big adjustment for me, working at just a corporation.
I know the question wasn't for me, but
Yeah.
I'll just add one thing that Mark's comment made me think about is that I agree that there tends to be a lack of understanding of the nuances and of just how things work in a corporate world. And I'm not, yes, sometimes of the coverage I see of tech, I think is unfair. I'm actually fine with that. I think we need, the world needs that adversarial relationship. And I think that if anything, I want to see more critical coverage of tech. And having seen it from the inside, I have a lot of issues with it. Actually, issues I have, I think, are more subtle than a lot of the coverage that I'm seeing. And I actually think, I'm not a big fan of, the revolving doors between industry, working in industry and covering the industry. But at the same time, I don't understand how you can cover tech without understanding from the inside how these companies work, because the incentives are so subtle, and the people who, build the things that you might disagree with at Facebook, I promise you they believe they're really doing the right things, and it's just so easy to cover it as like evil versus good. But actually, it's so much more complex, and only once you've worked on the inside do you understand the systems, and that is our job as journalists, is to understand systemic issues and fight the black and white, the simplistic explanations. And so I think an experience of working inside the corporate world should be a requirement to covering the corporate world. You're just never going to understand it, even as an excellent reporter, if you only ever see it from the outside.
I think that the challenge here, the reality is that once journalists enter the corporate world, it's very hard to leave, right? It's in terms of compensation, career path, all of these things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot of lovely incentives that are hard to give up, but there's, plenty. There's plenty to make you want to. I mean, I left, and there's plenty to make you want to go back to the news world. I didn't leave it entirely, but yes, the compensation is definitely problematic, and the way that you're treated as a human being as well, it actually can be nicer outside. But there's so much excellent work to be done as well in journalism that I think that's a big incentive.
One of the things that Mark and I were talking about before is this idea, there's this kind of perception that when you go into the corporate world, you're creating content with an agenda. And as we've just been saying, oftentimes journalists are actually creating content with an agenda, which is, hold power to account. but what you end up losing sometimes are the nuances to the actual story. And like you were saying before, Mark, just because a company makes a profit doesn't make that necessarily a bad thing. There could have been good business decisions that were made that led to that profit. So it's an interesting, parallel to see that there are agendas, whether you're in a newsroom or out.
Yeah. I mean, I think profit is a dirty word for a lot of journalists, and it shouldn't be. The world is governed by profit and loss, and whether we like it or not, media is a business in itself, and it's governed by profit and loss. Your readers can desert you, your audiences can desert you. They find something better. We live in a competitive landscape, and we need to work with that and be mindful of that, and think of ways of incentivizing. And actually, I think that kind of incentivization culture within the corporate world, if you can bring a little bit of that into your media business, you're that much better for it, frankly, because it galvanizes your team, it galvanizes the audience, it gives a sense of purpose to everyone. So, I think there are a lot of lessons there,
Yeah, I think we lie to ourselves a lot in journalism if we think we're not working for corporations. I mean, News Corp is a corporation, Reach is a corporation, I know The Guardian is a trust, a nonprofit, but it's kind of a corporation as well. The BBC is a public corporation, and we, for decades, have talked about this wall between business and editorial. I think mainly what that has done is create generations of journalists completely unprepared for the realities of an industry that is a business, and a sort of covering business. And if anything, I have seen more ethical compromissions when I was working in a newspaper. I have felt the freest and the most uncompromised in my work as a journalist in the years that I spent at LinkedIn. And the best guarantee of independence is financial security and financial independence. And so if we have struggling businesses, we're not going to dare lose an advertiser, and we're not going to do the coverage that we should be doing.
Right.
So building those business skills, having healthy corporations is the best assurance of good journalism.
I'd love to hear from you guys. Does anybody have any questions out here for us? Well, not for me, but for these ones. We've got a bit more time, so do jump in if anybody has any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Garrett, nice to know you. Just wanted to ask, for those who are looking at these jobs that never existed before, you're scraping the ads and you suddenly look at the description and go, I get it. It's a combination of a lot of skill sets that I think I have, but I've never seen it all in one place before. So how would you advise people to approach that? And if a recruiter is watching this, what would you like them to do differently in finding talent in the corporate world from journalism?
Did everybody hear the question?
I think you need for the stream to repeat the question.
Okay, so the question was, when you've got a whole bunch of skills that you might have built up in your job as a journalist, all of a sudden presented together in a role in the corporate world. I lost it. I'm going to need you to repeat that one, sorry. I got the last bit, though, about what advice would you give to a recruiter?
Really just to kind of give some tips for people who are interested
How would you?
in the transition. Like, how should you approach these jobs? Because you've never seen it packaged in such a way.
Okay. So practical tips for how do you approach jumping into the corporate world if you've never seen a job packaged like that before?
So one tip, and that's personal experience of mine, as I said to you, I had a personal reason to join, and I think we all have personal interests. Some of you will have a health interest, a technology interest, a science interest, just as you have as journalists. And I would think to yourself, if you do have that sort of specialism or that focus to your journalistic sort of endeavor, what companies are out there that might fit that bill, and sort of almost turn it on its head. So for me, I had a real passion when it came to public health, but I didn't want to just go to a company that sort of promoted public health. I wanted to try and look for something that paradoxically was directed at public health, but from another direction, and hence where I ended up. But for other people, it might be, climate change, and you could be thinking about the renewable industry. There are a lot of jobs out there, for example, at the moment, because it's such a growth area, around electric vehicles, around electric charging, around the technology. Lots and lots of businesses. I was approached by one just the other day, looking for journalists to work in-house in a content team, building their corporate messaging around that. So, again, if you've worked in a field as a journalist covering climate or covering sustainability issues, you're looking for companies that are building content operations and communications operations, and therefore seeking journalists with that kind of interest. I think the interest is the key thing here. That'd be my tip, anyway.
I think also perhaps take the time to sit down and take a look at what your skills are, because you might think of yourself as, oh, I'm a reporter, I'm an editor. Well, what does that mean in terms of skill? Okay, you're able to do research, you're good with people, you're good at synthesizing information, you're a good writer. We underestimate that, but I promise you most people cannot write. They cannot make one sensical paragraph. I promise you. So that is incredibly valuable. Maybe you're a visual journalist, maybe you're a data journalist. What are those skills that you have? And so then instead of introducing yourself as just, oh, I'm a reporter, well, instead, here's the skill set I have. I'm great at researching, writing, storytelling, putting data together, whatever it is. And so kind of just reframing in a way how you think about your skills and how you introduce your skills to the world, and that's going to suddenly really broaden the array of roles that you realize that you're available and capable for. And I strongly recommend, even when you're not in active job search, as just professional hygiene, regularly, keeping job alerts, looking at what's out there, because you really don't know what you want or what you're ready for until something just kind of lights up, and it's just looking at a lot of what's out there and continuing to have conversations.
Yeah, I think, and then all of the above, and of course, using your network and being here, talking to people. I think that a lot of 5 years ago, I wouldn't even known that a job like this really existed. And with someone with my background, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm perfect for this job, and I didn't even know it. So just kind of keeping an open mind. On the flip side, hopefully recruiters can also keep an open mind. And I think the fact that they kept an open mind with me, I had no pharmaceutical or healthcare background. I was an entertainment writer, but they loved what I could bring to the table. And so hopefully the recruiters aren't looking for a unicorn, looking for someone who can really leverage and flesh out their skill sets.
I think we've got time for one more question, if there is a question here. No, maybe not. Maybe not. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Great job, Garrett. Nice. Yeah, it was fun. Really fun.